So we have saved the best for last in this conference. Um, the last session of the afternoon is about employment and lifelong learning. And so we are really, really interested in hearing about our panelists' research and experience related to technology's promise for the future of migrant workers. So arguably, labor market integration is the most important form of integration that newcomers look for when they first arrive in Canada, because it predicates many other forms of settlement and integration. And so we know that immigrants in Canada, of course, face numerous challenges, although over the past 8 to 10 years, there have been some improvements in the labor market outcomes of skilled immigrants. There continue to be massive levels of disparities that continue to exist. So the 2021 census, for example, indicates that newcomers in Canada are twice as likely as Canadians to be overqualified for their job. So about 20% of new immigrants in Canada who have a university degree are still working in a job that only requires high school education. So we've made some progress, perhaps through some immigration policy, perhaps through some strategies that have been applied by the settlement sector, maybe, but we still have a long way to go. And so this panel will kind of allow us to think a little bit deeply about how technology and technological change fits into this picture. So let me introduce my panelists. First, we have Wendy Souquier, and Wendy is a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University and the founder of the Diversity Institute. And next we have Jean-Christophe Dumont, excuse me. Jean-Christophe is the head of International Migration Division at the OECD. Next to Jean-Christophe, we have Suzanne Huot. Suzanne is an assistant professor in the Department of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at UBC, University of British Columbia. Next to Suzanne, we have Shamira. Shamira joined World Education Services as managing director and now is also the deputy executive director of WES. And finally, at the head of the table, we have Joel Martin. Joel Martin is the Chief Digital Research Officer and Chief Science Officer at the National Research Council of Canada. So welcome to our panelists. Okay, so I have prepared a set of questions which I will direct to each of you. But I want to make this a very open conversation. So of course, everybody is very free to pitch in. So my first question is to Joel. So Joel, in light of the skill requirements, the changes in the skill requirements that have been influenced by technological advancements like AI and automation, how do you see employer expectations towards immigrant workers changing? How is it being affected?
I'm going to start by saying thank you to having me here. I've learned quite a bit. I'm coming from the technology side, and so all of those questions that were raised in the introduction, I think, wow, those are hard questions. Technology is certainly part of the way to address it. And to your specific question, there's not one answer. We heard in the first panel that there's a wide range of capabilities. So people are coming in with different levels of digital literacy, coming in with different languages, and some of those languages aren't represented in the digital technologies. Some people don't have access. And so if you draw 3 circles as a Venn diagram, the center is very large, but there are people in the others, and you have to come up with different solutions for the different sectors at least. And it will depend a lot on what the job is that the person is aspiring to. So just as a preface, there are a huge number of variations, and we'll have to answer the question differently in different cases. I think that there is a set of digital literacy expectations that you all know. And I'm probably not going to say anything different than has been said before, but maybe I'll pull it all into one answer to this question, that there are things that you have to know. You have to know how to use email. You have to be able to use the internet, use a web browser. Maybe there are some jobs still that don't require that, maybe some construction jobs maybe, but I think it's becoming less and less likely that you can even apply for jobs if you don't have some of those basic skills. Then also for using Word and Excel, many jobs are going to require at least a basic competency. That me whistling?
Thought it was just my ears.
Okay. And then there are others. So PDFs. So maybe you know how to use Word, but you're supposed to submit your job application in a PDF. Who knows? There are a whole bunch of these expectations that are not easy. And some people are going to be, it's just going to be second nature for them, but some are going to need help. Then there's a next level. If you're working in an office that you may need to know the extra things about Excel for doing pivot tables or data analytics, or for MS Teams, you need to know how to record a meeting or something like that, just that extra level of skill set on top of that. So I think that there are those basic skills. And if you go back 50 years, all of these are new. These are things that were not important 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 10 years ago. I think that there's another, for me personally, when I'm hiring somebody, I'm thinking about keeping that person at the National Research Council for 3 years or 5 years or even longer. And all of these technologies are going to change. So in 5 years, everything's going to be completely different. So assessing their ability to program in Perl using these things or whatever, Python using whatever the libraries are, that's not going to be good enough. I want to assess somebody's ability to learn new tools. And so I think that that's actually a capability. Not all employers are going to know to do this, but they should be. And so you can imagine a case where somebody comes in and they're doing data entry and say, oh, wait, we've got a new data entry tool as part of your interview. This data entry tool uses this, this, and this, and it's instead of Excel. Here's some sample data, please enter it for us and ask any questions you want about how they use the tool. And what they're actually assessing is your ability to learn a new tool. So I think that that's an important part of that employers should be expecting. Not all are going to be doing it now. Okay, now I get to AI. And this would be, it's not something that everybody's going to be required to do, but it may be a useful skill, even if the employer doesn't know it. There are some skills like prompting. If you go back far enough and you didn't know, and Google was just introducing their search engine, it was an important skill to be able to send a query, a question to Google and get a useful answer. It's not obvious. Maybe it's just so obvious to you. You've been doing it for so long that it is obvious. Now we've got ChatGPT. How do you send in a prompt to ChatGPT to get a very useful answer? You can get training in this. You can go watch YouTube videos on how to do this better or worse. You can also use these AI tools for many other tasks. One very important one, if you're coming into the country to do software engineering, programming, you better know how to use the AI tools because everybody is using them. You use ChatGPT or one of the other tools to help you as an aid. It doesn't do your job for you, but it's an aid. And if you can't do that, you're not going to be as productive as everyone else. And you'll be tested on it. Then I could go on and on about all of these different tools, but it's a useful skill for any new person to the country to have for a variety of purposes. You can ask it questions about Canada, about Canadian culture, about language. A really fun experiment, if you'd like to try it, is you can ask it in maybe your first language. You can ask ChatGPT to interactively ask you everyday questions in English or in French, and then correct your answers and suggest better answers, and then ask the next question. And you can do that. It works. I've got some sample text if you'd like to try it as a sample prompt, but it works. And it gives you this opportunity to practice answering the questions. And maybe when you're just learning English, you would give one answer answers, one word answers, and then it can come back and give you a suggestion for alternatives. Okay, so I think that all of those skills, I mean, we're building a pyramid of all of these skills that people have to be able to have in order to demonstrate their capacity.
Really interesting. Thanks, Joel. Thanks for building that pyramid for us. I wanted to throw it out to anybody else. I know many of you have either researched or actually, done hiring. And I would love to hear if there are any other kind of changing skill requirements that you see employers asking for, requiring from immigrant workers based on new technological innovations. Yeah.
Sleep, I apologize. It's interesting because it is true that digital skills are key. It is true that there is a digital divide. It is true that we need to ensure people have access to networks and technology and so on. But it's also true that some people come to Canada with very deep technology skills and they're still not getting employed. I mean, 40% of internationally educated engineers in this country are underemployed. So I feel like in the current environment, and I'm a bit of a fan of the ESTC Skills for Success model, which does include digital skills, does include numeracy, but also includes, interpersonal skills, communications, all of those things. And based on what I see, it's very job dependent. So I agree that, I mean, now there are more jobs outside of the ICT sector where digital skills are required. And even truck drivers and increasingly construction is becoming more and more digitally intensive. So I absolutely agree that they're important right across, but it's almost as if they're necessary but insufficient because we know that lots of newcomers, because of the point system, lots of newcomers come with incredibly deep technology skills. And, the research that we do is trying to better understand how employers understand skills, how we assess skills, how we develop skills, and even more importantly, how we utilize skills, because it's very clear that it isn't just a question about fixing the newcomers, although we can talk about, where some of the gaps often occur. We know that apologies for those of you who work in this space, but language training in Canada has been an abject failure, and we just do not do a good job. And there's huge potential for technological solutions, adaptive learning, things like that, to help with communication skills. That being said, we just did some research that showed that while language scores are predictive of earnings over the long term, they don't predict employment. So we have a real disconnect, in my view, between the kind of rational, we're bringing in highly educated people with good skills to meet the needs of employers story, and then what happens to those people who come here. And I think part of it is because we're not clear about what we really mean by skills. And frankly, 90% of private sector employment is with small, medium enterprises. And often what they mean by skills is just like me, as opposed to anything that is accessible or measurable. So we do have to, I think, confront that reality. That being said, what's really interesting, and of course you've done this research, Rupa, is the evidence that once employers hire immigrants, they hire more immigrants. Once you can get people in the door, they will keep hiring them, but it's breaking through that initial barrier. So I'm focused a lot on adaptive models, and we do a lot of upskilling, reskilling, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't say there's a template. I think a lot of the frameworks that exist don't actually connect to what employers want. But if you start with employers, you can actually design training programs to meet their needs, but you have to start with specific jobs, specific employers, specific sectors, as opposed to having sort of general ideas about skills frameworks, because I don't think there's evidence that works.
Thanks so much, Wendy. I really appreciate you adding the necessary but not sufficient piece, because I think sometimes we do think that maybe these technological skills or whatever X kind of skills is going to be the magic bullet. And we've seen time and again that they're not. It's much more complex than that. Okay, so the next question is for Suzanne. So I know you've done some research work on gig and platform workers. So I'm wondering how the emergence of gig and platform workers really changes and reshapes the conventional understanding of labor market integration altogether for new immigrant populations.
Certainly. Thanks for the question, Rupa. I think in some of the earlier work that I did as part of my doctoral studies, I was interested in social and cultural forms of integration. And in every interview that I did, the questions kept coming back to economic integration, with people saying that if you can't put food on the table, if you can't pay the bills, it's hard to go out and make friends and engage in some of those more social activities. And so that the economic integration through employment to access revenue is key to people's experiences. But what we're seeing in the growth of the platform economy, especially with what happened in the pandemic, when there were more opportunities becoming available in that platform economy, is that people are finding alternative means of revenue generation now, so that they aren't tied to traditional, entry-level forms of employment where they're going through, single employers and trying to get through that. And so in one of the recent projects that I was involved with, the participants really talked about being caught in this kind of balancing act, where for a lot of them, they described this kind of platform work as a form of side hustle, so that they might have one part-time job, but that wasn't enough to make ends meet. And so they were also doing some of these other things on the side. And what they liked about that was some of the flexibility that was built into it and some of the autonomy that they saw as being characteristic of those forms of jobs. And so for people who maybe aren't as familiar with the platform economy, some of what we might be most familiar with is what's called the sharing economy, where people use their personal assets and resources and monetize those. So if you have a car, you can become an Uber driver. If you have an extra bedroom, you can rent that out through VRBO. But also the gig economy, that's these short-term contracts, things like editing, freelancing, transcribing services, as well as peer-to-peer. So thinking through the kind of, UBC families or Facebook Marketplace, where people are posting things online and reselling secondhand goods and things like that to bring in money, in addition to, either balancing a lot of these different kinds of platform jobs or balancing that with more traditional forms of work, and also social media influencers who really kind of set their own schedule, right? So these are things that when I was in elementary school, it was never like, I want to be a YouTube star when I grow up, right? Because that was before the internet existed. But I could see my son doing that, right? If I think about the amount of time I spend watching YouTube with my son, that there's new opportunities that are being opened up by this. But with anything novel, we see that oftentimes policy, and it was mentioned yesterday, is not as quick to catch up to the technological advancement. And so in some of the interviews that we did with key informants, so people who were working in the settlement services sector and employment services for immigrants, in many ways talked about the platform economy as being an inevitable avenue for a lot of newcomers, that they acknowledge the kinds of labor market roadblocks that Wendy was just talking about and that Joel had mentioned, that it's hard to get through to some employers. And so the ease of entry then to the platform economy is very attractive to a lot of people who can access work immediately. And as some of Anna's work has shown with Laura Lamb, that can become a trap. So on the one hand, some immigrants described it as a potential stepping stone, but people who have worked with clients for a long time didn't see that next step coming for some of their clients, and talk about how some of them, once you get used to making that money, it's hard to walk away and maybe try to access other forms of employment elsewhere. So they really characterized a lot of these immigrants who were involved in platform work as being both overworked and underprotected, and saying that there was a cost associated, a sort of longer term cost associated with the shorter term gains of being able to access this. So there were threats to work-life balance, where people were having to work 14 hours days to make the kind of money that they might be able to make, you know, in a traditional 8-hour day if the pay was sufficient. Because if you're waiting for rides, you know, you're driving back from dropping people off, none of that is paid. And so they get caught in the middle of this sort of jurisdictional gray zone of, are they employees or are they self-employed? And so that's something where the key informants really talked about the need to redefine sustainability in relation to work. So they talked about the need to empower gig workers, the urgency for government regulation in this sector, and to really advocate for workers' rights within the platform economy. But it also depends who you talk to, because depending on what form of platform work people are doing, some of them were cautious about wanting it to be overly regulated because they were worried that that would threaten some of the flexibility that they gained from doing that. So there was, and again, I think it depends on the kind of work that you do, but there was one woman who's an artist, and she develops a client base through social media, and she then sells her paintings to people. So she gets to know the clients, and she's getting work through people who commission specific works from her. But not everyone is a skilled artist, right? So I think it depends, what skill set are you bringing to the platform economy, and how are you able to translate that into some sort of financial success. And I think lastly, one thing that I'll mention is that for people who are still continuing to look for traditional work, the project that I'm doing right now is part of Bridging Divides with Dr. Samantha Jackson over there. Give everyone a wave. Was talking about people's just experiences of employment seeking. And what we're seeing is that a lot of them were talking about LinkedIn and Indeed and these kinds of platforms that help you look for work, you know, versus the kind of corkboard jog boards that we used to go and tear a little paper off or see what was posted or go door to door with our paper resumes. That a lot of them talked about needing to really be wary of scams. So on the one hand, you know, it facilitates looking for work, but also subjects them to a lot of forms of vulnerability where people are offering them fake jobs to get their social insurance numbers. And so that sort of, you know, the conversations that we've had around forms of literacy become very important in this kind of electronic or digitally facilitated job seeking, where newcomers who maybe don't understand their workers' rights in Canada's may be subjected to forms of vulnerability and abuse right from the stages of employment seeking. So I'll stop there for now, but maybe circle back to some other stuff later.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. I think the duality and the levels of both benefit and risk are kind of, you know, constant themes in all of these discussions. Any other thoughts before we move to the next question? Okay, then we're going to move right on to Shamira. So through your work at WES, I know you have a wealth of experience with the credential recognition sort of ecosystem, and credential recognition still remains a major issue and a major factor that impedes labor market integration of foreign educated newcomers. So how is technology influencing the definition and assessment and recognition of immigrants' credentials and skills?
I wish I had spoken after Wendy had. I was watching it to say, let me go through. So I'm not a researcher. I am a former bureaucrat and a policy wonk, for those of you who know me. And I'm also a practitioner in terms of being very practical around the question you're asking me. So I'm going to first take it at the really macro level. When we talk about technology, we have this sense of technology as AI and chat GTP and Excel sheets. The reality is that in terms of, you know, disrupting migration, I divide technology into two spaces. One is using technology to make the work that we do a lot more efficient so that I don't walk around with paper. And so it's a matter of, what does that look like from a migration perspective when you're looking at an immigrant's journey? Because while they're still overseas and deciding to come to Canada or any other country, what is the mechanism they use to seek information, and how easy is it to basically find that information and use that information to make decisions? And that's one component of technology that I don't think we're doing too well. It's complex. IRCC, especially when you're looking at recruitment and selection, makes it so difficult. So you then have agents and aggregators, et cetera. Different story. Then you have technology in terms of how do you assess an individual's skills in order to make a decision around for immigration, and then for licensing, and then the labor market. So when we talk about, recognition remains a significant hurdle, we all assume that it's credential recognition to the macro level. Yet there are three definitions when we look at credential recognition. The first is academic credential recognition. So this, I believe, in terms of what has happened in the many years, WES has been around for 50 years, 25 years in Canada next year, we have addressed the issue of academic credential assessments. People have their documents. They basically come to an organization like WES, they will get their assessments done. And, people have a really good sense. Do I have a BA or not, depending on the educational system they're coming from. The second part is assessing licensing or those in regulated occupations. That's very different. That moves beyond my degree to degree to course by course. What courses did I take? And, did I basically meet the standards that are expected in a different jurisdiction? And the kind of experience I had, internships, and how do you assess all of that to provide a license? That's a different kind of credential assessment. And that's where all the issues are. We talked about it at my table. And then the third, and for those of you who were there on 2 days ago when I spoke, is the way employers assess credentials and what they do. And Wendy spoke to that, is that they basically assess, do you have the necessary experience and skills that I need for you to be able to do the job in a Canadian context? And they don't know how to do that. So they will either use a resume to say, I don't really know what that means. Or they'll look at their academic credentials and go, yeah, that's good, but it doesn't mean anything to me in a Canadian context. And then they'll look at the experience. And then they say, I actually don't know how to take that and transfer it to my context. So therefore, you don't have Canadian experience. And so, when we are talking about these issues, what I would hope for and wish for is that we are clear, that we don't keep on talking about the recognition of credentials remains an issue. It is, what are we talking about? And I believe that we have reached a point where employers need to quit talking about there are all these people and they don't have Canadian experience. It's what is their responsibility to basically build the necessary tools. So now I go to technology. There has to be a mechanism to come up with, technological tools to assess skills and experience, even while people are still overseas. My 15 years of experience as a bureaucrat, how are you going to take that experience in terms of my ability to work with diverse stakeholders in the political sense with, individuals, et cetera? How are you going to judge me in terms of how I write cabinet submissions and when government changes and whatever else? And if you can't do that, then, you've just lost valuable skills that I bring to the employer. And then you'll go back to, well, I can't find people when there've been 1 million people who've been here for 3 years. So, anyway.
I think Wendy has another point to make. Thank you so much, Shamira. Very, very interesting.
The issue is we talk about skills, we talk about credentials, but that's really not what's going on. And so there are a couple of things. It is true that employers could develop better systems. But when you're talking about small, medium enterprises, often the person doing the hiring is the person who's washing the windows, taking out the garbage, and fixing the computers. So typically you don't have a lot of capacity. And I think that one of the most effective, and this is based on looking at a lot of different programs, you do need some basic ability to screen, but work integrated learning is one of the very best mechanisms for both getting newcomers the experience and the training that they need, and building the confidence with employers. And as you know, Shamir, because we've talked about this, with a lot of the regulated professions, and the universities are complicit in this as well. Like, I'm on a bit of a rampage about predatory training practices. There are a lot of bridging programs that go nowhere because they focus on the credentials, they focus on the testing, when in fact the barrier to practice is the internship, the placement, or the experience, right? And that's the piece. Like, we have to keep looking at credentials, we have to look at skills, we have to look at the assessments. But the reality is, one of the biggest barriers is getting those placements, whether you're a doctor, an engineer, or a carpenter. And so I think they're really interesting, innovative programs that lead to employment, but also lead employers to start looking for skills and talent in more than the usual places. So I think, there are a lot of practical solutions that are not very theoretical. And it has a lot, in my view, to really understanding what the problem is, because there are too many training programs, quite honestly, that create jobs for the people doing the training and nobody else.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Wendy. Jean-Christophe.
So yeah, just to complement what has been said, I think notably when it comes to migration management, the move has not yet taken place from some thinking around labor needs to skills needs. Recruitment is all about skills these days, and whether these are digital skills or skills more broadly, as it has been explained. I mean, in Burning Glass study recently published, 90% of analyzed jobs do not even state the degree requirement. So employers are looking for skills, not looking for specific degree necessarily, or not even always thinking in terms of occupation. Yet the labor migration system is still based less in Canada than in elsewhere in the OECD on occupation, shortage occupation lists, for example. And soft skills are not factoring in the system as well. In the point-based system, you value degree, you don't value skills. So there is a need to make the labor migration system or the economic migration system evolve also to better match the functioning of a labor market, which down the line should also facilitate access to jobs.
Thank you for bringing up the soft skills and the mismatch between the immigration system and the labor market, which remains an incredibly difficult issue. Joel.
Just a quick comment, a quick observation that technology is not the solution to many of these problems we've heard. It's part of the landscape. It's part of what we need to keep in mind, but the solution has to be something a little more.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the trend throughout the entire conference, really, is that these are much deeper issues, systemic issues in which technology is simply a tool, maybe. Okay, so my next question is to Wendy. So we know, of course, that upskilling and reskilling is incredibly crucial for newcomers' labor market integration. How do you see ADTs impacting this process? So in addition to that, what are the benefits? But then what are the maybe ripple effects that we should be mindful of and consider when we use these technologies in upskilling and reskilling initiatives?
So I'll start with the last piece of the question first, because there are lots of people in the audience that are very deep into responsible use of AI and how technologies can introduce bias. They can also be exclusionary, and so on. And I think that's a very important and deep question to answer. So I'll sort of park that for now. But where I see the really interesting opportunities is both where the digital jobs are, first off, and understanding how those are changing and the skills that are required for them. But then also how we can use technology to upskill and reskill quickly, assuming people have access to the technology, and the basic technological skills. And what is, I call it the English major's revenge, because what we are seeing is one of the biggest impacts of AI. I don't want to overstate it, but I will for the purposes of this discussion, is that low code, no code applications mean that a lot of English majors can actually develop applications as quickly as traditional coders. And in fact, we work with a lot of AI companies that will say that traditional coding and the mindset that goes with that is sort of antithetical to the way their applications work. And they would rather take someone who doesn't have that training. And, we're very interested in how to create those pathways. But when you think about it, prompt engineering for a lot of generative AI applications requires the ability to use language precisely and specifically. Now that is both an opportunity and a threat, because as we said, often one of the biggest challenges newcomers have are around language skills. And so we have lots of newcomers with traditional computer science degrees who may not have facility with some of these newer applications. So there are two kinds of upskilling, reskilling opportunities I see coming out of this, and we've experimented with both of them. One is, again, focused on employers. Large government agencies or large consulting firms say, we need 20 PEGA experts. How long does it take to teach someone PEGA? 6 weeks. You can get them accredited. Salesforce, how many people in the room are familiar with Salesforce? It's huge demand application, in-demand application, and there are shortages of people who know how to do it. You can get accredited with Salesforce in a number of weeks. So taking technologically trained newcomers and giving them very quick access to tools that are in demand in the workplace, I think is a very effective strategy. And discouraging them from doing the third master's degree, which unfortunately is what we see over and over and over again. I do an MBA, I didn't get a job, so now I'll do a master's degree in finance, instead of having much better assessments of what you really need to get employed, because often it isn't another master's degree. Often it's a 6-week course. So that's one dimension to this. And then the other, and I'm a big defender of arts and social sciences and think you should study what you want because we can always get you a job, is looking at rapid upskilling for people outside of computer science and engineering and transitioning them into technology-related jobs. And for both of those, there are technology tools that can help do it. You still need coaches, you still need mentors, but the, standing in front of the classroom models of teaching, in my view, don't work. And if you can get an employer who will commit up front to hiring people who have obtained the certification, that's a bonus. But I think we have to really flip the script about how we design and implement programs. And some organizations like the Ismaili Council of Canada, for example, are actually doing pre-arrival training. IECBC is doing that as well, where instead of waiting till for people to come to Canada, they've identified high demand areas and mapped out pathways for them to start their training before they come.
Yeah, really interesting ideas and a change in the way we even think about approaching this question, which I think is really crucial. Any other thoughts to add on this issue of reskilling and upskilling and the role of technology before I move on? Shamira.
A comment in terms of, Wendy, how would people find out about these courses? Because, I hear you in terms of don't take a third master's degree. And what you're talking about is, micro-credentials, and then the whole issue of recognizing micro-credentials as bona fide in terms of being employed, and what does that look like? So I'm just curious in terms of how would people find out, and how do you ensure that it's recognized for the workplace?
Yeah, it's, I will be diplomatic. How will I be diplomatic? What I would say is we have a lot of duplication, fragmentation, and challenges with navigation and wayfinding. And we need organizations that say that they are committed to newcomer integration to perhaps start thinking about some of these issues in a different way. We did a review of several hundred programs, and the number of programs that offer skills training with no evidence of employers anywhere near the programs, and this applies to colleges and universities as well as independent agencies. Like, it's not just that I'm in a business school, it's from a practical perspective. You can't train people for imaginary jobs. You have to start with the employers, and we have to get the funders to incentivize more collaboration, less duplication, and stronger evaluations so that we're duplicating and replicating stuff that works for somebody. And I feel there are big gaps in the accountability and transparency around where money is going and what the outcomes are.
I mean, that's in the numbers. We see that's the case. And the importance of employers in this entire story, I think, is something that if there's a key takeaway, that needs to be really part of the key takeaway, I would say. So we're going to move to a question to Jean-Christophe. So we know that digital technologies have facilitated greater flexibility in the professional workplace, and there are new options for remote work and a rise in digital nomadism. So with many highly skilled digital workers now choosing remote work or even mobile lifestyles in some cases, what are some of the challenges for employers and even states in adapting policies for compensation, benefits, and employment protections?
Well, thank you. Before I go to this very specific question, I just want to come back with some broad numbers to give a sense of the challenges we are facing right now. So pre-COVID and pre-ChatGPT, the OECD did already a study in the employment outlook about the impact of digital transformation on jobs. And they estimated by then that 14% of the jobs were at risk of automation, and 32% would be structurally transformed in the next 2 decades. In the last employment outlook, they read down this estimation, and they found that now with ChatGPT, 27% of all occupation are at risk of automation. And this is not only low-skilled occupation, it's everything like professors, translators, lawyers, programmers, you mentioned it. So that's really transformative for sure. I mean, before COVID in Europe, 16% of the people were teleworking occasionally. Post-COVID, almost 40% are regularly teleworking. And if you look at tertiary educated, it's more than 70% were teleworking. So it's a really strong shock to the system, which first impact the labor market. And the transition here is, I mean, compared to previous economic change that we have witnessed normally with, notably with various phases of globalization, it's much more rapid. And it's also across the whole economy. So for small and larger firms, for public and private sector, and for all sectors almost. And so despite the ongoing efforts of OECD countries to train, retrain, upskill, this is really the strong focus these days to meet the needs of the labor market. It's very unlikely that the system will be able to cope with the demand. And so the situation in which we may be is that OECD countries basically are competing for these scarce skills, which are actually not so much in oversupply in the rest of the world, to respond to this demand. So I think this is the first shock. It's in terms of the demand and in terms of labor migration. We mentioned second shock on settlement services. I don't want to go back to that, but I think there are many, many ways that this is impacting also integration, provision, and identification of needs. One thing that we haven't discussed so much is the impact of digitalization on migration management. You mentioned it very briefly, but I think this is also very, should not be underestimated. It goes from, digital case processing, document issuance, entry, compliance, enforcement measures. If you look at OECD countries, more than half of them currently have digitalization program. They all introduce chat box, provide information on their immigration system. There's a lot going on in the asylum sphere regarding, asylum processing, speech recognition, etc. Greece has a program to facilitate citizenship through an AI program. Netherlands have a digital traveler pilot trying to facilitate mobility of people. So there are going to be a lot of things happening on the migration management side due to digitalization. And I would bet with anyone here that the Canadian point-based system will disappear in 10 years' time. There would be some other ways and tools to assess the potential of people who want to come to Canada. But okay, you asked me specifically about digital nomads. And the reason I mentioned that last is because this is probably the element which I think is the less transformative. There's a lot of traction on this question of digital nomad during the COVID period. And it's true that for a number of structural reasons, like the diffusion of high-speed internet, now you can be on a beach in Greece or in Mexico and have 5G connection. Video conferencing tools, we're all using that these days, online collaborative platforms, cloud solution, etc. All that has developed so rapidly during COVID, so the potential was there. I think many young people, notably, were also questioning about, why I'm doing this. Is it my job? Do I want to live in that place? And so there was a lot of, thinking about ways of life and opportunities in life. And so there's also a lot of people trying to take advantage of this option, so that OECD countries and countries in the world have responded creating programs. There are about 12 countries which have opportunity for digital nomads, 6 which have a real specific visa, 22 countries we counted non-OECD countries in the world which have this opportunity. So it's quite widespread, but it takes very different form to be honest. And it's very attractive for everyone, migrants because of the quality and cost of living, but also countries of origin expecting more local consumption, fiscal benefits. Companies, they are thinking that initially they were thinking that's a way to access to a larger pool of talents and also to lower, notably, expatriation costs. So, all planets seems to align, but at the end of the day, only few thousands of these visas, there are some exceptions, maybe Mexico is one of them, have been issued. And there are many reasons for that, which are linked to a number of limitations. If I start from the migrant themselves, they realize that this digital nomad only give them possibility to work remotely. They cannot work locally. So for them, the value added of this visa is limited. If they don't make enough money through this international contract, they cannot complement it with local source of income. From the countries of destination, there is big risk of misuse, abuse, and there are also potential costs in terms of healthcare, notably on some other social costs. And from the firm size, obviously, first of all, I think most firms realize that going 100% online for teamwork is not ideal, and that you need some presence to make team really work in practice. But more than this, firms also realize that where they employ remote worker who are based abroad for more than 183 days, they may trigger a permanent establishment risk, which is an obligation for the company to pay corporate tax in another jurisdiction. So for the company, it's not necessarily also really a super deal. So at the end of the day, of all this transformation, yes, it's true, digital nomad attracted a lot of attention, but I think if digitalization will become a part of our life, it's unlikely that digital nomadism will become the new normal.
Jean-Christophe, really important points that maybe we shouldn't get all excited about this particular issue as much as maybe we are. I see a few other people might have a few points here. So we have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So I would love to hear any other thoughts on this issue. Joel?
I wanted to come back to the automation or the digitalization of the process, immigration processing. There's going to be a lot of excitement very quickly, and then we're going to realize all of the mistakes that have been made because it's already hard enough to check people's credentials. And if you're doing automatic screening of resumes, you're going to miss very important ones, and there will be lawsuits, and then it'll become a very unpopular idea. And then gradually there will be a unified solution that takes into account the responsible use of the technologies.
Yeah, Shamir.
To that, because migration management and actually what you've discussed already exists right now. There is a program called Chinook, and many people might be familiar with that. And the way Chinook is being used is just a data processing tool. You know, put in the applications, you get a decision. And what you need is judgment. Immigration officers need to make judgment. Just because somebody's application looks a particular way or they come from a particular country doesn't mean that they can't be, a bona fide immigrant. So we have to be really careful in terms of bias, use of judgment, and they already have a lot of lawsuits. So I'm in agreement.
Wendy?
I just wanted to add, and it may have been mentioned, but one dimension of the platform economy is outsourcing of certain skills. So often we think of platform stuff as Uber drivers and so on, but I know people whose executive assistant works out of the Philippines. I know large consulting firms that outsource the preparation of their PowerPoints overnight to India. And there was a big move around outsourcing of IT-related stuff about 20 years ago. I see it resurging for certain kinds of tasks. And so when we're trying to look at labor market models and demands, we do have to take that into account, that employers may be focused on bringing people here, but then they may stop and say, well, maybe we won't do that. Maybe we'll outsource instead.
All of these things are intimately connected, and thanks for bringing that up. So that is our panel discussion part of the afternoon. Now I would like to open it up for questions from the audience. I know we have a lot of questions, so we have some roaming mics. Where are the roaming mics? So I see question right there at the back. Yeah.
Hi. Oh, Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Asma. I'm from Okasi, but before this, I was doing some research on Pakistani migrant workers building eco-smart cities in Abu Dhabi. So, or one of the cities. So the question of like technology and like what to focus on, because it was sort of on sustainable development and how that interacts with migrant justice. And so one question that I've just been I'm thinking about throughout this whole conference is, how do we ensure that, how do we make sure that justice or migrant justice, whether it's distributive, corrective, or intergenerational, how do we make sure justice is kind of stays the center of this discussion and not just sort of like an afterthought or sort of, you know, and also kind of not just how do we make sure that discussion is also goes beyond the kind of discussion on only responsibility? So just that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another one. We have here, Laura.
Thank you. Tariq Madhu, University of Bristol. Jean-Christophe Dumont, you said, if I understood you rightly, you said a number of things. I may possibly misunderstood, but I think you said that the latest analysis that you were aware of that OECD was working with was that in economies that the OECD is interested in, perhaps 27% of jobs could be automated, though I'm not sure in what time period, because that obviously is very important. Are we talking about 2 years or 12 years, for instance? But that's quite a staggering thought. I mean, the question of the roundtable is, what is technology's promise for the future of migrant workers? So that's not very promising. But going back to yesterday's session, Ibrahim Bagheri used the example of the introduction of tractors in US agriculture in the 1950s and 60s. And he said 250,000 jobs were lost, but 8% was added to the GDP. So there are gains and there are losses. There are gains for some people, losses for others, gains for some parts of the country or economy and losses for others and so on. So in a way, to address these kinds of questions, don't we need some macro level assumptions about where the economy is likely to be? Now, we obviously can't predict, but we can construct some scenarios which could be optimistic, pessimistic, in between, and whatever. And there may be different scenarios for different parts of the world and so on. But I just wonder, given what you said, can we really address the questions of ADT and jobs and migrations without a kind of a larger macro picture about where technology and its impact on the economy is going?
I see over here. Gentlemen.
Thank you. Elian Sawafta from the University of Alberta. I think like right now, after all of these fabulous roundtables and discussions, we know that there's human rights violations in using technology in different ways. So maybe my question now, like what role does technology play in enhancing the right and protection rights and the protection for or of migrant rights? This is, I think, it's just like a question now. If we are bringing like people from outside, what the role we are expecting by using technology? Like Shamira mentioned, Chinook is excluding some people, but how we are thinking about like these technologies to save people who are coming from outside. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question before we move on. I know there's a question at the back. The lady had her hand up there. Then we'll take the.
Hi, Julie from Brock University, and I want to ask about a context that is closer to home for many of us. And I was thinking about, specifically, I was thinking about migrant, immigrant, and newcomer workers in academia. And I was thinking specifically about the Workday human resources portal that many institutions use. And I was thinking about the lawsuit that was brought against Workday for discriminating against, I believe someone would have to fact check this, but I believe it was Black, disabled, and older job applicants who were going through the system. And so because of the, specifically because of the AI aspects and the algorithms in that platform. And I'm asking about academia in particular because this is something that my own department has come up against. So I'm in a critical criminology program. And what we found out was that through Workday, any person who wants to apply for an academic job has to disclose whether they have a criminal record or not. And we found out that this was not a requirement from the university, but it's just part of the software. It's part of the program. And therefore, it is extremely difficult to remove. And so I want to ask the panel if they have any thoughts on countering the use of AI in facilitating discriminatory hiring practices in academia as well as other sectors, but also thoughts on countering the use of AI to avoid liability, avoid questions of liability or accountability when it comes to discrimination in hiring practices. Because I feel that sometimes, like if we found out that it was a hiring committee that was discriminating against certain applicants, there would be an outcry. It would be easier to challenge that. But I think sometimes for some individuals, like if it's brought up as, well, it's just part of the program, then it's just kind of like, well, what are you going to do? And then the question kind of fades away. So wondering if the panel has any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So maybe we'll tackle those 4 questions. So the first question was really about where migrant justice fits into this whole discussion that we're having about technology and labor market integration. I don't know, does anyone have a comment on that?
Change it up. I feel like as though out of the 4 questions, 3 are similar in nature, in that it's the whole question around balancing the efficient use of technology and understanding that there are implications, whether it's bias and whatever else. And I'm not sure whether there's, at least, I'm not sure there's an answer to that, because right now I believe, just strictly as an observer and not as a researcher or somebody in academia, is that I don't think that we have paid enough attention to understand, unless Wendy has done some work in this area, around the implications of technology, whether it's for managing operationally or making decisions, the impact on migration and immigrants, and it's happening everywhere. So I think that this is something that we're doing like one-off, and yet it's important questions that people are asking. And somebody had said, what research needs to be done? And here is a piece of research that becomes really important.
Great point, that this is not something we necessarily have the answer to, but certainly something we should be asking. Suzanne, did you?
Just a quick addition. The Treasury Board of Canada has a directive on automated decision-making. You can search for this. This is required for the government to use AI. They have to go through this impact assessment. There are different levels of it, and it should apply to any software that the government is applying or using.
Thank you.
I don't think that I have an answer to the question of justice, though I agree it's absolutely an important one. And I think that it's not a fluke that immigrants are overrepresented in the platform economy, given the very precarious nature of the work that is involved in that economy. So justice is absolutely a key consideration there. But it reminds me of the discussion that we were having just before this panel around the ways that inequities are inherent in the applications of these and thinking through how those power relations will shape who stands to gain or be privileged within a particular system and who stands to be marginalized by it. And I know that when the BC government led consultations on ride hail and food delivery services, because they want to try to better govern that, you know, there was a lot of protest for instance, limiting the number of cars on the road, because now people who are driving, it's not a sustainable form of income generation for them anymore. There's too much competition and they aren't able to generate enough money, even though they're spending hours and hours and hours on the road. But if we limit the numbers of cars on the road, who's not then going to have access to that kind of work, right? That it was a very quick and accessible form of income for people. If we limit that, who are we taking those opportunities away from? And so I think there are still questions around justice and equity that have to be raised and clearly thought through in any sort of governance that we try to then layer on to this, right? So following that consultation, we have some ideas of what some of the solutions may be, but we still need to think through what the implications of those solutions are, and who's going to benefit from those solutions and who ultimately will not.
Wendy, did you want to make a point on that?
So I'll pick up on two things. I think your point about scenarios, dead on. And whether we're talking about green jobs, whether we're talking about impact of IT, it's one of the things we've been doing at the Future Skills Center more and more, because quite honestly, anyone's predictions, usually you can, and I worked with the Institute for the Future for a number of years, often we can predict direction. We cannot predict speed. And so if you think about things like video conferencing, it's been around for 40 years, but it was COVID that made us all Zoom heads or whatever. And similarly, who predicted the pandemic? Like, we did a review of strategic plans from cities across the country. We found one that had pandemic as a potential mega trend that might impact our lives. So I actually think it's worthwhile doing projections, but most of them are wrong. And it's better to have scenarios. If this and this and this, what would happen? And to think less about planning, because it's hard to plan when you can't predict, and more about creating adaptive, resilient systems. So if this happened, here are the things we could do. And that's why I'm a big believer in rapid upskilling, reskilling, focused on short-term things, as opposed to, you know, saying we need twice as many engineers and then the .com market crashes and suddenly there are all these unemployed engineers. So that was one thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say, and I don't mean to be facetious, but academic hiring committees did not need AI to be discriminatory. And the point is very, very well taken about some of the platforms that are being used. The thing about AI or automated systems is normally, if you take the time to look, you can find out what the decision process is based on, what the rules are, what the criteria are. And I would suggest, having worked in this sector since before many of you were born, that there is less transparency about humans making hiring decisions in academia than there needs to be. And there needs to be way, way more thoughtfulness and structure and accountability, because even without the technology, there's lots of bad stuff going on.
Thanks, Wendy. Yeah, Jean-Christophe.
Yes, trying to respond directly to a question from Tariq. So yes, 27% of job at risk, high risk of automation doesn't mean that it will be 20% of less job. Because obviously there would be also some new jobs created, and this is happening like every day. What it means really is that upskilling and reskilling is the key, because people will have to change job. And this is not only that, it's also at the same time happening the Green Deal or the green transformation, which is also impacting the labor market tremendously. I mean, in a few years' time, car mechanics will probably almost disappear, or at least change very, very drastically. So you're right. How this is assessed? This is based on the analysis of tasks by occupation. And my colleagues are looking at tasks that can be automated. And so if a large share of a task in one specific, very specific occupation can be automated, it means that the job can be automated. So what we don't know, as was said, is at which speed that will happen. If it happens very, very quickly, I think we are in trouble because we don't necessarily have trained yet the people to do the job. If that takes more time, we might also be in trouble. No, because previous economic transformation has shown is that when people anticipate that some occupation will disappear, they stop going into this occupation, which means that they're obviously looking for something that leads to more career, long-term career opportunities. And if the transformation is not quick enough, it leaves some hiring that are not met. And so actually vacancies in declining occupation are higher than in growing in relative term. I mean, in relative term, in growing occupation. And immigrants are needed to fill these gaps. But the immigration system need to be capable of enabling the hiring of these people in occupation which are disappearing, which is not so obvious at this stage.
Complicated point, but important one. Joel.
So I wanted to take a shot at a piece of the optimistic promise scenario for a couple of the questions. Yes, okay, we're going to be losing some percentage of our current jobs. One promise for immigrants coming in new to a task with these very powerful tools around is that they can help define the future. They can figure out the ways, they can do experiments and figure out ways to use the new powers to transform the job. And I mean, that sounds maybe grandiose, but it happened when people started using Google. It happened when the word processor came out. It happened when Microsoft Office became available. All of these times really changed the way people did the work, and somebody was there innovating to say, oh, this is the way we're changing our workforce. So that's part of the optimism in the near term. Also, with respect to the question that arose about what's the optimistic side of having all of these automated decision making? Is it going to help us in some way? I think that there is an optimistic twist that yes, people are making biased decisions already, and it's not transparent. The focus on responsible AI is giving us a workbench in order to expose the ethics and the bias, and et cetera. It's not, we know we can't be perfect, but we can make it more transparent. And as a very simple example, responsible AI, a very common exercise is to try to come up with explanations for decisions. And those explanations are objectively verifiable. It's not based on some individual person you can't talk to. And if we can get to that point, we may actually have a much more rich society than we had before when all of the decisions were hidden.
Thank you for that optimism. I appreciate that. Okay, Suzanne.
Yeah, inspired by Joel's optimism, I want to share just a few additional examples as well of in a sub-study that we did of content creators as part of the platform economy of immigrant content creators. In particular, they were able to use these different platforms like Instagram, like YouTube, to leverage the skills that they already had. So for instance, operating transnationally to create content in their mother tongue, right? And sharing that with audiences and diasporas across multiple countries. And so, you know, having a quite larger audience than just being, you know, connected to only their local, like geographically based communities. And so there was a range of people who used those linguistic skills or skills from their previous degrees to create content on topics that they were very knowledgeable about and to disseminate that information and generate revenue that way. And there was even one person recently who was working remotely and taking what he was learning from his remote work and creating YouTube videos on that to inform other newcomers who might be interested in sort of doing the same kind of work, to give them a leg up and to sort of learn from his experience. So I think it was interesting the ways that it highlighted, I mean, certainly there are still limitations to it, but highlighting people's own agency and use of their own skills, linguistic and otherwise, through these platforms that were available to them to make something of it.
Yeah, great example. Shamira?
I need to, because I don't want to be a Debbie Downer in terms of, the promise of technology. And it's about my own organization, as you heard me say, 50 years old, 25 years in Canada. And we, before COVID, only accepted envelopes with original documents, sealed envelopes with original documents that were verified, and we had individuals who would make sure we had all the paper, everything was there before we evaluated. What we did because of COVID and all the borders were closed is we used the opportunity to get in touch with, it's almost 200 institutions, almost 50,000 different degrees, etc. And I have the data here. Our digital intake was 7%. So we had lots of envelopes. Trust me, I know where they're set. By the end of 2020, it was 65%. Now it is close to 90% for the top 5 countries. Can you imagine the efficiency in terms of what has happened? Because the documents are coming digitally in a secure format. They're already verified. And basically, we can turn around decisions fairly quickly as long as everything is there. And so that's just an example. And what I also know in terms of, the conversation here is that a number of immigrants during COVID basically used their prior skills, whether they were in the medical profession or IT engineering, to develop apps, to basically just think differently in terms of, how to provide, whether it was courses or anything else, digitally in a very different way, not just putting courses up, but actually conversations, etc. And so that basically was where you have a crisis. You need to do something differently. And, they become business entrepreneurs. There was no choice. And look at where they are today.
Great example. Thank you. I appreciate the optimism at the end of the conference. I think it's really important. Wendy.
Yeah, I think just building on that, there is a sort of prevailing attitude, I think, in the settlement sector that's changing a little bit. But the idea that you go to self-employment because you are excluded from traditional labor market, and entrepreneurship is kind of I won't say a dirty word, but kind of a dirty word. And what we're finding is immigrants have a higher propensity to entrepreneurship. Some are necessity entrepreneurs pushed into it because they're excluded from the regular economy, but some prefer to work for themselves. And I do think that if we're thinking about, innovation, economic growth, opportunities for trade, et cetera, making sure that we consider not just self-employment in the gig economy, but self-employment in the context of entrepreneurship as a legitimate pathway for newcomers, because our experience, and we've run a number of different programs, is even if people do not become business owners in the end, if you take a Syrian refugee, and we've worked with a lot of them, our 150th family arrived last night, which is why I'm tired. If you take a Syrian refugee, you put them in an entrepreneurship training program, they learn English, they learn culture, they have a higher sense of self-efficacy and self-worth, and they'll still learn English probably faster than they would sitting in a linked classroom. So, I think entrepreneurship training is also a really interesting opportunity to look at it from an experiential learning perspective, because it doesn't matter what kind of job you're going into now, having some entrepreneurial skills is going to be an advantage. That's as optimistic as I get.
Thanks, Wendy. Just checking in. No questions from online. We have a quiet online. I think we're getting close to the end. So I just wanted to thank all of our panelists for really practical, really implementable recommendations and insights that both analyze the situation, but also provide some solutions, some potential solutions at least. So I'm going to leave it on that note, and I appreciate your comments. Thank you.